Harold Simmons eased himself into his favorite armchair, the leather creaking beneath his weight. At 78, he wore his age like a badge of honor, silver hair neatly combed, wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose, and a cardigan that had seen better days but felt like an old friend. The modest living room around him was a testament to a life well lived. Photos of smiling grandchildren adorned the mantel, while a shelf nearby housed bowling trophies from his younger days. Sunlight streamed through lace curtains, casting a warm glow on the hardwood floors he'd installed himself decades ago. Harold's gnarled fingers fumbled with the remote, finally managing to switch on the evening news. As the anchor's voice filled the room, his mind wandered to the reason for his restlessness, the letter that had arrived that morning. He glanced at the coffee table where the envelope lay, its official-looking seal and gold embossing, lending it an air of importance. "Congratulations!" it proclaimed in bold letters. "You've been selected." A lifetime of hard work had left Harold comfortable, if not wealthy. The pension from 40 years at the steel mill, combined with his late wife Martha's savings from her teaching career, meant he didn't have to worry about making ends meet. But the promise of more, of leaving a true legacy for his grandkids, was tempting. The doorbell chimed, interrupting his musings. Harold grunted as he pushed himself to his feet, joints protesting the sudden movement. He shuffled to the door, wondering who could be calling at this hour. "Mr. Simmons?" A young man in a crisp suit stood on the porch, flashing a brilliant white smile. "I'm Michael from Prosperity Partners. I believe you received our letter?" Harold blinked, caught off guard. Yes, just this morning. I wasn't expecting. Oh, we like to provide personalized service to our most valued potential clients," Michael said smoothly, holding up a sleek leather briefcase. "May I come in? I'd love to discuss this amazing opportunity with you." Something in the back of Harold's mind urged caution, a faint echo of Martha's voice reminding him to be wary of strangers bearing gifts. But the young man's earnest expression and professional demeanor quelled his doubts. After all, hadn't he always taught his own children to be polite? "Well, I suppose that would be all right," Harold said, stepping back to allow Michael entry. "Though I'm not sure I understand all this talk of opportunities. At my age, I'm not looking to shake things up too much." Michael chuckled as he followed Harold into the living room. "Mr. Simmons, that's exactly why we're here. You've worked hard your whole life. Don't you deserve to enjoy the fruits of your labor? To really make the most of your golden years?" As they settled into their seats, Harold in his trusty armchair, Michael perched on the edge of the sofa, the older man couldn't help but feel a flutter of excitement. It had been years since he'd felt truly important, truly listened to. "Now," Michael said, opening his briefcase with a flourish, "let me show you how Prosperity Partners can turn your lifetime of hard work into a legacy that will secure your family's future for generations to come." Harold leaned forward, eyes wide behind his glasses, as Michael began to lay out documents covered in impressive-looking charts and graphs. The numbers danced before him, promises of returns that seemed too good to be true. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows lengthened across the room, Harold found himself nodding along, the caution in his heart giving way to hope. After all, he thought, what harm could come from simply listening? Little did he know that this seemingly innocuous meeting was about to set in motion a chain of events that would shatter the tranquil life he'd built, testing his faith in humanity and forcing him to confront the true cost of trust in a world all too eager to prey on the vulnerable. The next morning, Harold woke with an unfamiliar sense of anticipation. The meeting with Michael from Prosperity Partners had left him buzzing with possibility. He went through his usual routine, a bowl of oatmeal, a cup of black coffee, and the morning paper. But his mind kept drifting to the glossy brochures spread across his kitchen table. "Guaranteed returns," they proclaimed. "Exclusive investment opportunity." The numbers seemed to leap off the page, promising a future brighter than he'd dared to imagine in years. At 10 a.m. sharp, his phone rang. Harold answered on the second ring, recognizing Michael's smooth voice immediately. "Good morning, Mr. Simmons. I hope you've had a chance to look over the materials I left with you. Exciting stuff, isn't it?" Harold nodded, forgetting for a moment that Michael couldn't see him. "It certainly looks impressive," he said, trying to keep the eagerness out of his voice. "But I have to admit, some of these returns seem, well, almost too good to be true." Michael chuckled warmly. "I completely understand your caution, Mr. Simmons. It's that kind of wisdom that makes you an ideal client for us. But let me assure you, these aren't just projections. These are guaranteed returns backed by our proprietary investment strategy. As Michael launched into an explanation filled with terms like diversified portfolio and market arbitrage, Harold found himself struggling to keep up. It all sounded so sophisticated, so far beyond the simple savings account and government bonds he was used to. I don't know, Harold said hesitantly. It's a lot to take in. Maybe I should talk it over with my son first. He works in finance. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. When Michael spoke again, his voice had taken on a conspiratorial tone. Mr. Simmons, I respect your desire to consult with family, but let me ask you something. Haven't you spent your whole life making decisions for yourself, building a life with your own two hands? Harold felt a swell of pride at those words. It was true. He'd always prided himself on his independence. Michael continued, This opportunity is exclusive and time sensitive. We're only offering it to a select few clients, and I'd hate to see you miss out because of hesitation. You've earned this chance, Mr. Simmons. Don't you think it's time to secure your legacy? The word legacy struck a chord deep within Harold. He thought of his grandchildren, of the world of opportunities that seemed to be slipping further out of reach with each passing year. What if this was his chance to make a real difference in their lives? Well, Harold said slowly, I suppose it wouldn't hurt to hear more about it. Excellent. Michael's enthusiasm was palpable. I knew you were a man of vision, Mr. Simmons. Now, let's talk about getting you started. We'll need to move quickly to secure your spot. As Michael outlined the next steps, Harold felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. He was stepping into unknown territory, but wasn't that what life was all about? Taking chances, seizing opportunities? By the end of the call, Harold had agreed to an initial investment, a sum that made his palms sweat, but that Michael assured him was just the beginning of his journey to financial freedom. As he hung up the phone, Harold looked around his modest home. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to dream big. Maybe he'd finally take that cruise Martha had always wanted. Maybe he'd be able to help his granddaughter with her college tuition. With a spring in his step that belied his age, Harold headed to the bank. The future, it seemed, was bright indeed. But as he drove down the familiar streets of his neighborhood, a small voice in the back of his mind, one that sounded suspiciously like Martha, whispered a note of caution. Harold pushed it aside. After all, he thought, what did he have to lose? Little did Harold know that this question would haunt him in the months to come as the true nature of Prosperity Partners' exclusive opportunity began to unravel, threatening to take with it not just his dreams, but everything he had worked for over a lifetime. Weeks turned into months, and Harold found himself caught in a whirlwind of financial decisions that seemed to accelerate with each passing day. His initial investment with Prosperity Partners had been substantial, nearly a quarter of his life savings. But Michael's frequent calls and glowing reports of exponential growth had Harold convinced he was on the right track. It was a crisp autumn morning when Harold sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by bank statements and investment reports. He squinted at the numbers, trying to make sense of the complex charts and figures. According to the latest update from Prosperity Partners, his initial investment had nearly tripled in value. This is incredible, Harold muttered to himself, a mixture of awe and disbelief in his voice. He reached for the phone, his fingers trembling slightly as he dialed Michael's number. Mr. Simmons, always a pleasure to hear from you, Michael's voice chirped through the speaker. I trust you've seen the latest figures? That's actually why I'm calling, Michael, Harold said. These returns, they're amazing, but I'm having trouble understanding exactly how. Say no more, Mr. Simmons, Michael interrupted smoothly. I completely understand. The intricacies of our investment strategy can be quite complex. But that's why you've partnered with us, isn't it? To benefit from our expertise while you enjoy your retirement. Harold nodded, forgetting again that Michael couldn't see him. Yes, of course. It's just that my son has been asking questions. He seems concerned. There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Michael spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly, taking on an air of confidentiality. Mr. Simmons, I hesitate to say this, but, well, it's not uncommon for family members to feel a bit of jealousy when they see this level of success. Your son might be feeling left out. The suggestion caught Harold off guard. Oh, I don't think. Of course, you know your family best, Michael continued. But in my experience, the best way to handle these situations is to show them the results. Actions speak louder than words, after all. In fact, I was just about to call you with an exciting new opportunity. As Michael launched into his pitch, Harold found himself nodding along. The idea of proving his financial acumen to his son, of showing that he wasn't just some doddering old man, was intoxicating. And if this new investment was half as successful as the last, all right, Michael, Harold heard himself say, let's do it. How much are we talking about? The figure Michael quoted made Harold's breath catch in his throat. It was more than he'd ever imagined investing, nearly all of his remaining liquid assets. But as Michael walked him through the projected returns, Harold felt his hesitation melting away. Think of it this way, Mr. Simmons, Michael said, his voice warm and reassuring. You're not just securing your own future, you're creating a legacy for your entire family. Isn't that worth taking a chance on? Legacy. There was that word again, tugging at Harold's heartstrings. With a deep breath, he made his decision. Let's make it happen, Michael. As he hung up the phone, Harold felt a mixture of exhilaration and vertigo, as if he'd just stepped off the edge of a cliff. But the promise of the wind beneath his wings was too alluring to resist. Over the next few weeks, Harold threw himself into his new role as a savvy investor. He pored over financial news, practiced dropping terms like market volatility and diversified portfolio into conversations, and even bought himself a new suit for his meetings with Michael. But as the leaves turned and fell from the trees outside his window, Harold couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The glowing reports from Prosperity Partners continued, but when he logged into his bank account, the numbers didn't seem to add up. Calls to Michael went unanswered more frequently, always with plausible excuses about being in meetings or traveling to close a big deal. It was a chilly November evening when the other shoe finally dropped. Harold was watching the evening news, absently flipping through his mail, when a headline caught his eye: FBI raids offices of suspected Ponzi scheme. As the reporter detailed the allegations against a company called Prosperity Partners, Harold felt the room spin around him. The remote slipped from his fingers, clattering to the floor as the full weight of what he'd done came crashing down. In that moment, as the cheerful anchor's voice droned on about millions lost and unsuspecting victims, Harold Simmons realized that his golden years had just turned to ash. The days following the news of Prosperity Partners' collapse blurred together for Harold. He moved through his house like a ghost, barely eating, hardly sleeping. The phone rang incessantly, his children, his bank, even a few reporters seeking comment. But Harold let it go to voicemail. He couldn't bear to face the reality of what had happened, let alone explain it to others. It was his daughter, Sarah, who finally broke through his isolation. She arrived unannounced one afternoon, using the spare key he'd given her years ago. Harold was sitting in his armchair, staring blankly at the muted TV when she walked in. Dad? Sarah's voice was soft, filled with concern. Dad, we've been trying to reach you for days. Harold looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and unfocused. Sarah, I'm sorry. Sarah crossed the room in a few quick steps, kneeling beside her father's chair. Oh, Dad, she said, taking his hand in hers. Why didn't you tell us what was going on? The gentle touch of his daughter's hand broke something inside Harold. Tears welled up in his eyes, and before he knew it, he was sobbing. Deep, racking sobs that shook his entire body. Sarah held him, murmuring soothing words as years of pride and independence crumbled away. When he finally regained his composure, Harold began to talk. He told Sarah everything about Michael's initial visit, the promises of incredible returns, the way he'd been drawn deeper and deeper into the scheme. As he spoke, the magnitude of his mistake became painfully clear. I've lost everything, Sarah, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The house, my savings, even your mother's pension, it's all gone. Sarah squeezed his hand. We'll figure this out, Dad. You're not alone in this. Over the next few weeks, the full extent of the damage became clear. The FBI investigation revealed that Prosperity Partners had been nothing more than an elaborate Ponzi scheme, with Michael and his associates using money from new investors to pay fake returns to earlier ones. By the time the authorities caught up, most of the money, including Harold's life savings, had vanished. Harold's children rallied around him. His son, David, took time off work to help sort through the financial mess, negotiating with creditors and looking for any assets that could be salvaged. Sarah moved in temporarily, helping Harold with day-to-day tasks that had become overwhelming in his state of depression. But even with their support, the road ahead looked bleak. The house would have to be sold to cover some of the debts. Harold's comfortable retirement had evaporated, leaving him facing his twilight years with nothing but Social Security to rely on. The hardest part, Harold found, wasn't the loss of money, as painful as that was. It was the loss of dignity, the feeling that he had let down not just himself, but his entire family. The legacy he had hoped to leave for his grandchildren had been replaced by a cautionary tale of greed and gullibility. One evening, as Harold sat on the porch watching the sunset, perhaps one of the last he'd see from this house, Sarah joined him, 2 mugs of tea in hand. "I spoke with David today," she said, passing a mug to her father. "He thinks he might have found a small apartment you could afford on your Social Security. It's not far from his place." Harold nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. That's good of him." They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the gentle clinking of spoons against ceramic. "Dad," Sarah said finally, her voice hesitant, "I know you're beating yourself up over this, but I want you to know we don't blame you. You were taken advantage of by professionals who knew exactly how to manipulate people's hopes and fears." Harold turned to look at his daughter, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. "I should have known better, Sarah. I should have listened to that little voice telling me it was too good to be true." Sarah reached out, placing her hand on his arm. "Maybe. But Dad, the thing that made you vulnerable, your desire to provide for your family, to leave a legacy, that's not something to be ashamed of. That's who you are. That's the man who raised us, who taught us the value of hard work and family." Tears pricked at Harold's eyes again, but this time they weren't entirely of sorrow. For the first time since the scandal broke, he felt a tiny flicker of hope. "We're going to get through this," Sarah continued. "It won't be easy, and things will be different. But you haven't lost everything, Dad. You haven't lost us." As the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Harold Simmons realized that while his golden years might not look the way he had imagined, they weren't over yet. The road ahead would be challenging, but he wouldn't have to walk it alone. With a deep breath, Harold squeezed his daughter's hand. "Thank you, Sarah," he said softly. I think I'm ready to start figuring out what comes next." As night fell, father and daughter sat together, sipping tea and talking quietly about the future. A future that, while uncertain, still held the possibility of redemption and hope. The following months were a whirlwind of change for Harold. The sale of his house went through quickly, thanks to David's connections in real estate. It was a bittersweet day when Harold stood in the empty living room, memories of a lifetime echoing off the bare walls. With a heavy heart, he turned the key one last time and walked away from the home he and Martha had built together. The small apartment David had found was indeed close to his son's home, just a few blocks away in a modest senior living community. It was clean and functional, but a far cry from the spacious house Harold had called home for decades. The first night, as he lay in his unfamiliar bed, the reality of his new circumstances hit him hard. But as days turned into weeks, Harold slowly began to adapt. Sarah had helped him decorate the apartment with a few cherished photos and mementos, giving the space a touch of warmth. His grandchildren visited often, their laughter and energy bringing life to the small rooms. One morning, about 2 months after the move, Harold found himself staring at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. The face looking back at him seemed older, more lined than he remembered, but there was a spark in his eyes that had been missing in the immediate aftermath of the scandal. "All right, Harold," he said to his reflection. "Time to stop feeling sorry for yourself and do something." That day marked a turning point. Harold reached out to an old friend from his bowling league, asking about volunteer opportunities in the community. Before long, he found himself spending 3 mornings a week at a local elementary school, helping kids learn to read. The work was rewarding in ways Harold hadn't anticipated. The children's enthusiasm was infectious, and their progress gave him a sense of purpose he'd been lacking. More than once, he caught himself thinking that Martha would have been proud of this new chapter in his life. Financially, things remained tight. Harold learned to budget carefully, clipping coupons and finding creative ways to stretch his Social Security check. It wasn't easy, but there was a certain satisfaction in making do, in rediscovering the frugality of his youth. The hardest part was letting go of the shame. Even as life settled into a new rhythm, Harold struggled with feelings of guilt and embarrassment. He avoided social gatherings, making excuses when old friends invited him out. It was David who finally confronted him about it. On a crisp spring morning, father and son sat on a park bench, watching David's kids play on the nearby playground. Dad, David said, his tone serious, I know you're still beating yourself up over what happened, but you can't keep isolating yourself like this. Harold sighed, his eyes following his grandchildren as they chased each other around the swings. I know, son. It's just every time I see someone from the old neighborhood, I feel like they're judging me. Like they're thinking, there goes old Harold, the fool who lost it all. David was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. You know, Dad, when all this first happened, I was angry. Not at you, but at those con artists who took advantage of you. I kept thinking about how I should have seen it coming, should have protected you somehow. Harold turned to look at his son, surprised by the admission. But then, David continued, I realized something. The man who raised me, who taught me about integrity and perseverance, that man is still here. You made a mistake, yes, but the way you've handled it, the way you've picked yourself up and found new ways to contribute, that's the father I've always looked up to. Tears welled up in Harold's eyes as David's words sank in. For the first time in months, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. Thank you, son, Harold said, his voice thick with emotion. I I needed to hear that. From that day forward, Harold made a conscious effort to re-engage with the world. He accepted invitations from old friends, shared his story openly when asked, and even found humor in some of the absurdities of his situation. As summer approached, Harold received an unexpected invitation. The elementary school where he volunteered was holding an end-of-year celebration, and they wanted to recognize his contributions. Standing in front of a room full of children, parents, and teachers, Harold felt a surge of pride as the principal praised his dedication. Looking out at the smiling faces, Harold realized that while his financial legacy might be gone, he was building a different kind of legacy, one of resilience, of giving back, of finding purpose in unexpected places. As he walked home that evening, the setting sun painting the sky in brilliant hues, Harold Simmons felt truly at peace for the first time since the scandal. His golden years hadn't turned out as he'd planned, but they were far from over. There were still chapters to be written, still ways to make a difference. With a spring in his step that belied his age, Harold headed home, ready to face whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. The road ahead was uncertain, but he was no longer afraid to walk it. 2 years had passed since Harold's life had been turned upside down by the Prosperity Partners scandal. The small apartment that had once felt alien now bore the comfortable marks of a well-lived life. Photos of grandchildren lined the walls, interspersed with colorful thank you cards from the students he tutored. On this particular morning, Harold stood in front of his mirror, adjusting his tie with practiced ease. At 80, he moved a bit slower, but there was a vitality in his eyes that belied his age. Today was a special day, one he had been both anticipating and dreading. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Come in, he called out, knowing who it would be. Sarah entered, a warm smile on her face. Ready to go, Dad? Harold nodded, taking one last look in the mirror. As ready as I'll ever be, I suppose. Together they made their way to Sarah's car. The drive was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. It wasn't until they pulled into the parking lot of the community center that Sarah broke the silence. Are you sure you want to do this, Dad? No one would blame you if you changed your mind. Harold took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. I'm sure. It's time. Inside, the community center's main hall was filled with people of all ages. A banner hung over the stage, Financial Literacy for Seniors Learning from Experience. Harold's name was listed as the keynote speaker. As he made his way to the front of the room, Harold felt a flutter of nervousness in his stomach. But when he looked out at the audience and saw the supportive faces of his family, David and his wife, Sarah and her husband, even his grandchildren, he felt his anxiety melt away. Good morning, Harold began, his voice strong and clear. My name is Harold Simmons, and 2 years ago I lost nearly everything to a Ponzi scheme. A hush fell over the room as Harold recounted his story. He spoke of the initial temptation, the escalating investments, and the crushing realization that it had all been a lie. But he also spoke of what came after, the support of his family, the challenges of starting over, and the unexpected joys he'd found in his new life. I stand before you today not as a victim, but as a survivor, Harold said, nearing the end of his speech. I lost my savings, yes, but I gained something far more valuable, a deeper appreciation for what truly matters in life. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. If my story can help even one person avoid the mistakes I made, then perhaps some good can come from my experience. Remember, if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Ask questions, seek advice from professionals you trust, and never be afraid to say no, even if the opportunity seems golden. As Harold concluded his speech, the room erupted in applause. People approached him afterward, some sharing their own stories, others thanking him for his honesty. It was overwhelming, but Harold felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. Later that evening, Harold sat on the small balcony of his apartment, surrounded by his family. They had insisted on coming over to celebrate the success of his speech. "I'm proud of you, Dad," David said, raising his glass in a toast. "What you did today? That took real courage." Harold smiled, looking around at the faces of his loved ones. "You know, when all of this first happened, I thought I'd lost everything. My money, my home, my dignity. But sitting here now, I realize I haven't lost a thing that truly matters." Sarah reached out and squeezed his hand. "We never doubted you for a second, Dad." As the sun set on another day, Harold Simmons felt a profound sense of peace. His golden years hadn't turned out the way he'd planned, but in many ways, they'd become richer than he could have imagined. He had faced his greatest mistake, learned from it, and found a way to use that experience to help others. The future stretched out before him, full of possibilities. There would be challenges, of course. Age brought its own set of obstacles. But Harold knew now that he had the strength to face whatever came his way. As laughter and conversation flowed around him, Harold closed his eyes and sent a silent thank you to Martha. Wherever she was, he hoped she could see that he was okay. More than okay. He was living, learning, and loving, making the most of every day. The golden years, Harold realized, weren't about wealth or easy living. They were about this: family, purpose, and the wisdom that comes from embracing both the highs and lows of life's journey. With a contented sigh, Harold opened his eyes and rejoined the conversation, grateful for the chance to write this unexpected but beautiful final chapter of his life.